Hollywood loves to tell you the 1970s was a golden age, and honestly it was. It was also the decade that swallowed careers whole, torched studio budgets, and sent some of the most talented directors in American cinema into professional exile. These were films that cost small fortunes and returned pocket change, productions where ambition and poor timing combined into something genuinely ruinous. One of them landed in theaters the exact same summer as Star Wars, and its director stood on the sidewalk watching Lucas's audience line up while his own film quietly died inside. 10 disasters, 10 cautionary tales, and one film that didn't just flop, it effectively dismantled one of the most decorated careers of the entire era. Starting at the bottom and working up, Myra Breckinridge represented Fox's attempt to capture the same counterculture audience that had turned Midnight Cowboy and Easy Rider into cultural events, which was a reasonable theory destroyed by spectacularly poor execution. The studio spent $5.38 million in 1970 terms on a satirical Gore Vidal novel about gender identity and Hollywood mythology, then handed it to British director Michael Sarne, whose feature filmography at that point was thin enough to read in under a minute. Surrounding him with Raquel Welch at the height of her fame, Mae West and Rex Reed seemed like it might compensate. It did not compensate. The film earned an X rating and generated walkouts, returning barely $3 million domestic in nominal figures. While Fox had been expecting something hip and commercially viable, Vidal himself disowned the finished picture, which is a particular kind of verdict when the source novelist publicly distances himself from his own adaptation. Sarne never directed another major studio film after this, which is, in the most clinical possible sense, a career conclusion, gone after one swing. When MGM handed Michelangelo Antonioni an American film with an American cast and a full studio budget, the thinking was that the man behind Blow Up could translate his visual intelligence across the Atlantic and produce something that would connect with young audiences already hungry for European-influenced cinema. The budget ran to approximately $7 million in 1970, though that figure is uncertain, and domestic returns came in under $1 million. What Antonioni delivered included a climactic sequence of genuine audacity. A house filled with consumer goods was detonated in slow motion, filmed simultaneously across 17 cameras using real explosives, and it remains extraordinary to watch even now. The problem was that the 90-plus minutes surrounding that sequence left audiences and critics feeling manipulated rather than moved, baffled by the pacing and alienated by the symbolism. Over the decades since, Zabriskie Point has been reassessed more generously as a striking visual document of its era. But in 1970, it represented a very expensive argument with the people who bought tickets. Columbia Pictures reached a simple conclusion in the early 1970s. They decided the problem with big-budget musicals was not a fading genre, it was a lack of ambition, and the solution was to remake Frank Capra's 1937 Lost Horizon as a fully staged musical with a score by Burt Bacharach and Hal David, and with Peter Finch and Liv Ullmann in singing roles. Columbia committed approximately $12 million, measured in 1973 dollars, to that theory. Domestic returns reached around $3.8 million. Critics at the time were blunt and unencouraging. The musical numbers drew particular attention for being uncomfortable to sit through. The irony is important. Bacharach and David were genuinely gifted composers, and the songs were not inherently the weak point, but placing them inside a film with no coherent identity made the music feel absurd rather than charming. Lost Horizon's failure carried consequences beyond its own ledger. It contributed to the broader industry conclusion that the era of the bloated Hollywood musical had reached its natural end. Occasionally, a film's disaster is historically productive. This was one of those times. Peter Bogdanovich in 1975 carried the kind of commercial credibility that made studio executives comfortable, having delivered The Last Picture Show, What's Up Doc, and Paper Moon in rapid succession, the last of which sent Tatum O'Neal home with an Academy Award. A Cole Porter musical homage starring Burt Reynolds and Sybil Shepherd, budgeted at around $2.2 million in 1975, looked from the outside like a manageable risk from a reliable filmmaker. Estimated gross came came in at around $1.5 million. What made At Long Last Love more damaging than a standard commercial disappointment was the critical response, which went well beyond negative into something closer to sustained mockery, shifting public perception of Bogdanovich in ways that a single box office failure rarely manages alone. Bogdanovich later acknowledged openly that making the film had been a mistake, which is a candid admission that most directors in his position would have avoided. The remainder of the decade found him working to rebuild the credibility he had earned over years, and the full recovery never quite arrived. Gene Hackman in the mid-1970s occupied a particular position in Hollywood where his presence alone carried weight. It was built on the back of the French Connection and The Conversation, attaching him to a Foreign Legion adventure set against the Rif War in Morocco alongside Catherine Deneuve, and with Columbia Pictures backing, seemed like a formula with genuine commercial potential. The budget ran to approximately $9 million in 1977, though that figure draws on limited sourcing and warrants caution, and domestic returns came in around $1 million. Reviewers found the pacing slow, the characters underdeveloped, and the historical setting underexplored. That meant a production with strong credentials on every visible axis somehow failed to generate anything compelling between those axes in the screen. March or Die sits in a specific category of Hollywood disaster, the kind where everything looks correct from a distance and falls apart on contact with an audience. It is a reminder that assembling talented people and a workable premise is a necessary condition for success, not a sufficient one. Irwin Allen had earned his reputation honestly, with The Poseidon Adventure in 1972 and The Towering Inferno in 1974 establishing him as the most commercially reliable disaster filmmaker in the business. That is why Warner Brothers approved approximately $21 million in 1978 terms for his killer B thriller without excessive resistance. The Swarm featured Michael Caine, Catherine Ross, and Richard Widmark delivering dialogue about African bee invasions with complete seriousness, and it returned roughly $10 million worldwide in nominal figures against that investment. The special effects disappointed audiences expecting the scale Allen had delivered before, and the script placed serious actors in positions that required more commitment than the material deserved, a combination that critics did not forgive. Caine has been candid in interviews about his decision-making during this period of his career. Beyond the individual failure, the Swarm's performance sent a clear signal to the industry that disaster films had exhausted their audience, that the cycle which had generated enormous returns earlier in the decade was finished, and that no amount of star power or producer reputation could restart it. The genre had not noticed the audience had moved on. Allen's film was the notification. By 1979, the disaster film was operating on borrowed time, and Meteor arrived to make the situation official. American International Pictures put approximately $16 million in 1979 behind a story about scientists racing to prevent a massive space rock from hitting Earth. Sean Connery and Natalie Wood provided the marquee value, but the film returned approximately $8.4 million worldwide in nominal figures, leaving the production well short of anything approaching profitability. The effects work blended early computer-assisted sequences with conventional practical techniques, and neither category impressed critics or audiences who had been conditioned by higher benchmarks. Meteor occupies an unfortunately precise position in film history, arriving at the intersection of two exhausted trends simultaneously, the disaster movie and the science fiction spectacle, at a moment when neither had enough remaining momentum to carry a production this underpowered. Bad timing compounded by execution that did not give audiences a reason to overlook it. The genuine strangeness of 1941's presence on this list starts with the name on the director's chair. Steven Spielberg, coming off Jaws in 1975 and Close Encounters of the Third Kind in 1977, was arguably the most commercially reliable filmmaker alive. Universal and Columbia jointly backed his sprawling World War II comedy to approximately $35 million, measured in 1979 dollars excluding marketing, and the cast spanned John Belushi, Dan Aykroyd, Robert Stack, Ned Beatty, and Toshiro Mifune. Domestic returns reached approximately $31.8 million nominal, with worldwide gross around $94.9 million, and those numbers look survivable until the marketing expenditure and theatrical revenue splits reduced them to something considerably less comfortable. The production featured enormous practical construction, including one of the largest indoor sets built at that point in Hollywood history for the USO dance hall sequence, and a sustained commitment to choreographed physical destruction that demonstrated genuine logistical competence. But here is the thing, this was not a failure of craft or ambition, it was a failure of proportion, a film that kept escalating the chaos without giving the audience an emotional anchor to hold on to, which Spielberg himself acknowledged in later years. The recovery was swift by any standard, with Raiders of the Lost Ark arriving 2 years later. But 1941 remains the instructive anomaly in a career that otherwise redefined what commercial cinema could do. William Friedkin in 1977 stood at a height that very few directors ever reach. The French Connection had won him the Academy Award for Best Director in 1971, and The Exorcist in 1973 had become one of the highest-grossing films in cinema history up to that point, placing Friedkin at the absolute summit of American filmmaking with the kind of credibility that should have insulated him from Catastrophe. And then he made Sorcerer, and Star Wars opened the same summer, and the distance between those two outcomes reshaped the rest of his professional life. The original budget for Sorcerer was $2.5 million, conceived as a modest side project, which makes the final figure of approximately $22 million in 1977 one of the more striking budget escalations in Hollywood in the 1970s. Star Wars, for reference, cost roughly half that amount. Sorcerer returned approximately $5.9 million domestically and around $9 million worldwide in nominal figures, leaving both Paramount and Universal facing losses that were impossible to minimize. The film adapts Henri Georges Clouzot's 1953 thriller The Wages of Fear, itself drawn from Georges Arnaud's 1950 novel, with Roy Scheider leading a cast of 4 men stranded in a remote South American location, each carrying a past they cannot escape, hired to drive unstable nitroglycerin across miles of jungle in 2 decaying trucks to extinguish an oil well fire. Those trucks, named Sorcerer and Lazaro, were heavily modified vehicles from the 1950s with reinforced bodywork and mechanically adapted systems built to survive the terrain, and they function throughout the film as characters with as much presence as the human cast. The central sequence requires driving both trucks across a rope suspension bridge during a tropical storm, a piece of practical filmmaking that demanded the bridge be constructed twice because the first location in the Dominican Republic saw its river dry up before the sequence could be completed, and the entire structure had to be rebuilt over a different river entirely. Friedkin contracted malaria during the shoot. The film ran drastically over schedule and budget, and he later described Sorcerer as the film of which he was most proud because it came closest to what he had envisioned. The score came from Tangerine Dream, their first Hollywood commission, and it remains genuinely unsettling in the best way. None of that saved the film. Here is the detail that makes Sorcerer's fate genuinely painful rather than merely unfortunate. Paramount held a contractual obligation to screen Sorcerer at Mann's Chinese Theater in Hollywood. Mann Theaters wanted to keep Star Wars running there, but the contract was the contract. Friedkin's film replaced Star Wars on one of the most famous screens in America and performed so poorly that Star Wars returned almost immediately, while Friedkin and his wife stood outside watching Lucas's audience from the sidewalk. The rights subsequently fell into such confusion between Universal and Paramount that Friedkin pursued legal action against both studios simply to make the film available on home video, meaning that for decades Sorcerer was nearly impossible to see. Roy Scheider described the experience of filming it as making Jaws look like a picnic. Friedkin said it brought him closest to his own vision. The audience in the summer of 1977 chose to watch Luke Skywalker for a third time instead. The reassessment has been thorough and well-deserved, with critics and filmmakers now treating Sorcerer as a masterwork of sustained tension and practical craft. And the film is now available for anyone who wants to understand what Friedkin was attempting. None of that restored what the failure cost him at the time. One final note before closing, because Raise the Titanic filmed through 1979 and represents the complete culmination of everything the decade got wrong about scale and ambition, Lou Grade's ITC Entertainment financed what became one of the most expensive productions ever attempted at that point, with a total budget reaching approximately $40 million in 1980 dollars, centered on a practical centerpiece that required a 55-foot scale model of the Titanic, reportedly costing $7 million on its own, filmed rising from a purpose-built water tank in Malta. Worldwide returns in nominal figures reached approximately $13.8 million, leaving ITC staring at losses that effectively ended the company's involvement in major film production. Grade's summary of the experience has been repeated ever since for very good reason, noting that lowering the Atlantic would have been the more economical option. He was not wrong. The 1970s produced some of the greatest American films ever made, and it also gave the industry a thorough education in what happens when ambition, poor timing, and an absence of honest feedback combine inside a large budget. Films that should have succeeded did not. Careers that seemed bulletproof were not, and the patterns underlying those failures repeat across Hollywood history with enough consistency to be worth tracking carefully. That is exactly the kind of story this channel keeps digging into, because the gap between what these films were supposed to be and what they became is where the most interesting history lives.